This is a tutorial looking at task dependencies if you're working on a project that has tasks and task dependencies. And I'm going to compare task dependencies on multiple different platforms, looking at Google Sheets, ClickUp, Monday, Wrike, SmartSheet, Notion, and finally Coda. So let's start right away with Google Sheets. This is my list of tasks in my project. And you'll notice that in my dependency column, I have a drop-down that basically looks at all the different task names in column A. The way you can do this is by simply going to, I think in each cell there is a validation. And the validation just simply looks at the sheet range from A2 to A15 down here. So all the options that you can select in this dependency column end up being a drop-down list that shows whatever's in column A. So for instance, complete class trailer relies on class editing, which is the previous row. Site copy relies on GTM planning kicked, which is up here. And this is the dependency column. So all these tasks, except for instructor shoot, rely on another task to be completed. The duration is just a number in the number of days it takes for that task to be complete. We have a team name, we have an owner for that task, and then these are actually formula columns. So if I look at task start date, this is simply, the first row is actually just going to be a hard-coded date, which is October 1st, 2020. The task end date is calculated by looking at the task start date plus the number of days that the task takes to complete. So 10-1 plus 5 days equals 10-6. Now, how do we calculate? In this project, we're going to be doing, each dependency has a start to, or finish to start dependency type. So that means complete class trailer cannot start until class editing is finished. And so in order to do that, I pulled in the dependency start date here. So let's look at the formula over here. This is actually just doing a VLOOKUP of the dependency from the task name and looking up when that task start date begins. So in this case, VLOOKUP B6 is going to look at class editing, and it's going to pull in 10-6 as the dependency start date. Dependency end date is simply looking at the same lookup, the dependency value in the table, and it pulls in the task end date, index number 7. So we have the dependency start date and end date here. So in order to figure out what the task start date can be for any one of these tasks, we have to look at the dependency end date for that specific task's dependency, because we know that that task cannot kick off until the dependency is complete. So that's why, except for instructor shoot, all these cells below simply look at the date of the dependency's end date. And then task start date, again, is just taking that task start date, which is the dependency's end date, and adds on the duration. So we can see here the tasks, the complete project can start on October 1st and can be complete by October 17th, assuming everything goes along the plan and each task takes the specific amount of duration. So this is how you can do a simple task dependency list or project in Excel or Google Sheets. And over here to the right, I kind of wanted to visualize what this project would look like on a kind of Gantt chart waterfall, where you can kind of see a cascading view of each task. Actually, we can probably drag this over to the right a little bit so we can see this locked in. We can kind of see a Gantt chart view of how the tasks cascade. And the way I did this Gantt chart was I put this is a very simplistic for just 30 days in October. But for each of these individual cells below, I look to basically see if that day number is between the task start date and the task end date. If it is, then just put a little X. If not, then there's a blank. So for instance, for 10.1 to 10.6 for instructor shoot, we have 6 X's here because 1 through 6, they fall within the days of these two dates. And so for each of these cells, you'll get a blank or an X. And then if there's an X in that range, I just do some conditional formatting here. Conditional formatting. So basically say if the cell is an empty, then just color it blue. So if I happen to put an X here, then it will color that blue, but I don't want to because I want to keep this formulaic. So what's really neat is if I change this start date to another date, let's say I change this to 10:15, all these dates will cascade down, and you'll see the Gantt chart kind of moves a little bit too. This obviously does not have the same flexibility as other tools because if I want to change one of these dates in the middle, there is no manual override. These are all formulaic. So everything is driven off of the task start date for the very first task in my task list, which works for some people because you want to be able to see how your whole project shifts as the project kickoff task changes as well. And so this is one of the nice things about Google Sheets, but also one of the downsides is that you can't change task dates willy-nilly because all the task dates and our dependencies are all tied by formulas. So how would it has dependencies using this same exact task list work in ClickUp? So I have a ClickUp project here, and I have the same exact list of tasks in ClickUp, and I have the duration here, the team, and in order to define a dependency for a task, you can actually click on the, how do I do it here? I believe, I think I did it on the Gantt chart. Was it on the Gantt chart? Let me take a look. No, so this is actually the same view. I'm trying to figure out how I exactly tied each dependency. Let's see here. I think it was, here we go. So for GTM plan kickoff, if I want to set the dependency to instructor shoot, I click on these 3 dots and I click on dependencies. And you can see here in waiting on, I can add other tasks that there are dependencies for, but I just picked instructor shoot and then I just went down the line, and for every single task, I click on the dependencies and I selected which dependency that task relies on. And what's really neat about ClickUp is that the minute you add a dependency, it will also show you what's blocking. So for instance, if I look at instructor shoot, look at dependencies, it doesn't wait on any tasks because that's the first task in the whole project, but it does block 3 different tasks, which means these 3 tasks treat instructor shoot as a dependency. So this is kind of like a nice view to be able to quickly see what your dependencies are and what other tasks that this current task is blocking. And it's kind of a neat little way to look at your project. And if you look all the way at the very bottom, you'll see that launch only depends on, I believe, task class on site, but this is a blocking task for promote on social media. So the one thing that you can't do, I believe, in ClickUp is you can't have the cascading dependency start and end dates. You kind of have to select each task start date and end date individually. So I believe, I think you can add in formulas too here. You can click on this formula call. Actually, I tried doing that here, but the formulas in ClickUp are pretty standard. You can only select a certain number of fields for the formula. You can also do advanced formulas. I was trying to create a more advanced formula here by clicking on advanced editor. And you can click on things like, I was trying to basically say task start date plus duration, but then the minute I start doing plus, I'm not able to pick on duration as number of days. And I think it's because these are incorrect column types to be using the formula. So I kind of gave up there. But if anyone knows how to do this, let me know. But what's really neat about once you set the dependencies for each individual task, and you can also have start dates and end dates and durations, when you click on calendar, you automatically can get a nice view of all the tasks and kind of like a little bit of waterfall on the calendar. Whoops, let me zoom out a little bit. And if you click on Gantt chart, this is probably the most similar view to Google Sheets and is a little more kind of robust in terms of its functionality. Is you can see how each task is a blocker or a dependent or has dependency depending on what you define in the list. And you can also collapse and expand the task to indicate how long that task will take. And then that expansion and I guess narrowing also affects, I believe, the start date and the duration. So kind of a neat thing here. Additionally, you can also click on an individual task in this list, in the Gantt chart. You can also see more details about that task, like what it's waiting on, what it's blocking, and also some more important metadata about that specific task. And you can also see history of how that task was being used. I think I also really like these buttons over here. You can actually look at the different path calculations. So if you want to look at the critical path, you can see the critical path of the project, which is a pretty common concept in project management. And you can also look at the slack time, which is also kind of neat visualization showing how much time is lagging in between different tasks being completed based on the dependencies of those tasks. So kind of an interesting way to see if there's any idle time during the project in terms of the duration of tasks. The last thing to point out for task dependencies in ClickUp is if you decide to, there's kind of like a standard status column for all these tasks. If you decide to close a task that has dependencies, it's going to pop up this warning message, which is kind of like a nice warning because you don't necessarily want to close a task if the dependency is not complete yet. And so the way you can set that up is actually, let me move this over here. I believe it's in the Click apps. I think by default, when you create dependencies in your ClickUp project, there is a dependency warning that you can click on, which will automatically give you that pop-up if you try to close a task that has a dependency. So that's kind of a neat little feature in ClickUp for closing tasks that perhaps should not be closed. So a little more kind of visually pleasing way to look at task dependencies with a calendar and a Gantt chart. So let's move on and look at Monday. So Monday, again, we have the same list of tasks. You have the duration again, the team, and the task start date. And actually, I was getting pretty far to be able to replicate the Google Sheets in terms of looking at dependency start dates, dependency end dates. The problem is you have to create all these multiple column types. So for instance, this dependency column is a specific type of specific type of column format in Monday. And you have to choose a date time column format that looks at your dependency. And once you do that, you can then select the dependency that this task relies on. Once you have that, though, if you want to pull in the start date for that dependency, there's no simple way to just pull in this value. You have to actually create, I forgot what the name of this column type. It's a linked column type. Normally you use this to link to other boards. It's kind of like a VLOOKUP in Google Sheets. But once you have this link column type, I just renamed this kind of like dependency dupe. It's an exact replica of this dependency column. Then you have these, what they're called mirror columns. It's looking at the dependency dupe, and then you can start pulling in the task start date and task end dates based on the dependency. And then, so for instance, the instructor shoot is a dependency of portraiture photography selected. the start date and end date for this dependency come from the actual start and end date of the instructor's shoot. The problem is you can't automatically kind of cascade the task start dates depending on what the dependency end date is. Remember from our Google Sheets, we want our task start date to be the end date of its dependency. So in Monday, I tried doing that in this formula here. This is a column type of a formula, and I try to say if the dependency is blank, then use the task start date, which is just looking at, this is kind of like a, yeah, basically I wasn't able to create the formula because I think the reason is because the dependent end date, this is not a date type. It actually is a mirrored column off of the task end date, but the task end date itself is a formula that, similar to Google Sheets, we take the task start date and we use this add days function and we add the number of duration days to the task start date. So that's how we're able to get October 1st plus 5 days equals October 6th. So I think because there's a mismatch in date types in this column, we're unable to actually dynamically change the task start date based on the dependency end date for that dependency. So if anyone knows how to create this start date to reflect the dependency end date, let me know. But as far as I can tell, you have to manually select each individual task start date, and then the end date will automatically calculate based on the duration of the days. So similar to Google Sheets, but has a limitation in terms of doing that automatic calculation of the task start date. So these are just kind of like the same exact days I believe I put in from the Google Sheets, but I have to manually put these in. And then once you have these set up, you can click on the timeline and you see kind of like a similar Gantt chart type of view of the tasks, but it's broken out by person, which I don't find that interesting. And then you can highlight over each thing. You can see more about that given task in the Gantt chart or waterfall, but it's not the most, I think, useful view to look at from a Gantt chart perspective. I think ClickUp has a more interesting view. Now, if I go to calendar, you can see basically all your tasks laid out on a calendar because everything has a task start date. So that's kind of neat. And what's also interesting is if you have a dependency here, again, this is a dependency column type, I can select, if I happen to select a date that's before, oh, that's strange. Before I could do this. Okay. Oh, no, never mind. Basically, if I try to select a start date for a task, but the dependency, yeah, it's not working right now, but in the past, the dependency, if you try to select a start date for a task that happens before when the dependency actually finishes, Monday will actually give you an error message and say, or not give you an error message, you have to actually do an automation. Let me show you up here. There's an automation. No, that's not it. Let's see here. I think it's Automation Center. There is, here we go. So adjust the date of an item to reflect the changes made in the date of its dependency item. Ensure that the task start date of an item always starts after the date of its dependency item. So this is kind of a little different. It basically says if you happen to change the task start date to a date that the dependency, to a date before when the dependency starts, it won't let you, and it'll just change it back to a date after its dependency. So I think that automation kind of starts on by default, but kind of a nice little error check for task dependencies. Okay, let's move on to Wrike. Again, same table. You notice a pattern here. Every single application has a table of tasks. The interesting thing about Wrike is you also can put in duration, start dates. You can also calculate the due date. I just did start date plus duration, which is kind of neat. You can just take the start date plus this number of days and it gives you the output. And so everything kind of cascades down correctly. In order to do predecessors, however, you have to put in the row number of the predecessor. So for instance, test class site, its predecessor is 4, which is class finishing. GTM, its predecessor is 2, which is instructor shoot. So it's kind of annoying to have to going in here and manually entering in the predecessor, but actually I can't even do it right now. I'm not sure why. Let's see here. Oops, no, that's not what I want to do. Where did I originally edit this? It wasn't in the board. Huh. Could have sworn I was able to edit this before. Okay, I'll edit that. I can't exactly remember how I did this. Let's go to Gantt chart. Let's take a look at this. I did it here in this view. Yeah, so this is the same table. I actually kind of like this is actually similar to ClickUp in terms of visualizing the kind of like a critical path of your project. You can see how there's arrows pointing into when tasks flow into the next one, which tasks are dependencies of which, and you can also drag and drop these and move them around, and the arrows will kind of follow along. I believe you can also, since I already set up these predecessors here, FS simply means finish to start. You can also do FF and SF and all that kind of stuff. I leave everything as FS for now. You can also drag and drop the arrows to individual tasks like that, and then it will reset the predecessor or task dependency for that given task. So this is also kind of like a neat little way to look at your tasks, their dependencies, and you can also do multiple predecessors as well. I'm going to remove this one for now, and everything will adjust. I think what's also neat is you can actually adjust the start date for things, and it'll automatically, similar to Google Sheets, it'll just move all the dates forward depending on when the start date is of your very first task in your project. And everything kind of cascades down. So that's kind of neat. The interesting, it's a little hard to drag it around, but it kind of works if you want that visual look. So very similar to ClickUp. Let's get a little more into kind of like spreadsheets. So we're going to look at SmartSheet next. So this is the same list of tasks. Similar to Wrike, you have to put in the predecessor row number. So the dependency column, this is actually a special column type. I forgot to get the column type. Yep, it's a predecessor current type. And you notice here I put the row number of its predecessor. So for GTM planning kickoff, its predecessor is instructor shoots. That's why there's a 1 here. Site copy, the predecessor, its dependency is number 2. And this is actually the most similar, I think, to Google Sheets in my opinion. Duration is also just a number of days, which is the same thing as I put in the Google Sheets here. Team, owner. The task start date also is, you can pick something here, but you notice that the task end date is also a column type. And when you add dependencies, if I go to edit project settings, when you add dependencies, you automatically get all these settings to click on, like, what is the dependency column, what is the duration column. So SmartSheet is very opinionated about how you can set up your dependencies. So if you want some custom dependency types, then it might be a little harder to do in SmartSheet, but having that kind of restriction gives you some more structure around creating dependencies. So I can't, if I just decide to change this date to something else, it won't let me. It'll give me this like, this will ruin all your predecessor relationships. I don't want that. What I do like to do is be able to change this date to something else, and everything will flow down because the task end date is built off of the duration, and that impacts when the task can start because they all have dependencies. I'm going to move this back to 1. Similar to the other platforms, you can look at things on a calendar view. The calendar view is pretty similar to Wrike and Monday. I think the Gantt chart view is also probably one of the more compelling views. Let me zoom out a little bit. It's going to be hard to see this all on one screen. But you can see how it's very similar to Wrike and to Monday, and to ClickUp for that matter. I think ClickUp is also very similar. They're all very, very similar to each other. You can also drag and drop, move dates around like this. I think you can't change these dates. Yeah, if you change these dates and also say you can't ruin the dependencies. And it's also a good way to visualize things. If you decide to change the start date for the very first task, everything kind of shifts on the timeline. What's neat about SmartSheet is that you don't have to write separate columns for dependency start date and dependency end dates, because like I said, SmartSheet has that built in. When you go to the project settings, you can see the dependency predecessor and duration types. And that is, oh, and you can also show the critical path as well, which is, I think, also in, I think it was ClickUp. Yeah, it was in ClickUp. So you can see the critical path for all the tasks. I don't think you can see the slack, though, which you can see in, yeah, okay. So that is SmartSheet. The next platform we're going to look at is Notion. So same exact list of tasks here with my task list. The dependency column is a relation column type, and that simply allows you to look at a column from the same table or different table. And when I do this, you can actually, I'm just going to do this one more time, test dependencies. You can select two different types of relation property types. I'm just going to use the same property. Hit cancel for now. So if I click on instructor shoot, you can see this is all the data associated with the instructor shoot row, class editing, everything associated with the class editing. You can see all this stuff here. So it's kind of like a nice, probably the nicest and simplest way to look at your dependencies. Duration is simply a column of numbers, which is the duration and number of days. We have team, owner. And here's when things started getting a little tricky, in which I couldn't quite figure out. So we have start date here, task start date. What I wanted the task start date to be is the same thing as Google Sheets, where we have this cascading number of dates. Unfortunately, I could not figure out the formula. I think it's because I tried to use, so these two columns are supposed to be formulas. The task end date is a pretty simple formula. It's simply just the task start date. Let me zoom in a little bit. The task start date, add the number of duration days. This is actually similar to the way I think ClickUp looks at formulas. And then you just say I want to add these days to the start date. And this is supposed to be 5 days after October 1st, which works out correctly. But then to get the dependency start dates and end dates, that was a little tricky. I couldn't quite figure it out. So these are roll-up columns, these two. And roll-up columns let you look at other properties from that specific task. So for instance, this is instructor shoot. This is looking at the task start date for the dependency column, which is, which is over here. And I tried doing some formulas here, which I couldn't quite figure out. But basically, what I was trying to do, using a combination of slice and the slice formula, but I couldn't quite figure it out. And this task start date was important. Actually, the task start date was the important one, where I want to say the dependency equals blank, just use 10.1 as a start date. But otherwise, I want to use the dependency end date. And you can't do that because dependency end date is not a date, because dependency end date is a roll-up column, which is not sure what, I mean, it's a specific column type, which cannot be converted to a date from what I can tell. So this is the farthest I can get in terms of looking at a task name and dependencies. You can also look at this list of tasks as a calendar, which is also kind of interesting, similar to the other platforms. Actually, I can't even see the other tasks because they don't have dates yet. Let me go back to the default view. If I add in a bunch of start dates here, I could probably see more things on the calendar. Let's just pick some random dates. And if I go back to calendar view, you'll see all these things. You can click on things and they'll pop up and it'll show you the page of all the related columns from that specific row in the calendar view. I think the board view is not that compelling for this use case, so we'll skip that. But yeah, from as far as I can tell, you have to manually select start dates, and then at least the task end date will automatically calculate based on what you select here, because it's simply adding the start date plus the duration. So not a close comparison to Google Sheets in terms of getting that kind of cascading dates, or to SmartSheet and to Wrike, and well, I guess Monday too. I don't think Monday actually has that capability. Okay, finally we're going to look at Coda. Coda, I have the same exact list of tasks. The dependency column is a lookup column to the all task table, which is this. So I can select any single task here that's coming from here. Very similar to Google Sheets, as a matter of fact. So if I change this instructor shoots, this will automatically change as well. So I'm going to change that back. Duration is a duration column format. Team name is a select list. Owner is just a list of people. My task start date, so these are all formulaic columns. If I look at these formulas, it's a pretty simple formula. Basically, it's looking to see, so this is actually where you select the date of the very first task. So if I select something like 10/7, you notice that all these dates automatically cascade, similar to Google Sheets. And if I look closely at these formulas here, depending on how you like to write formulas, basically it's saying if dependency is blank, which is this column right here, use the first task date, which is this variable right here. So again, if dependency is blank, just take the very first date, take the date to start the very first task. Otherwise, take the dependency end date as the start date for that task. So the dependency end date is this column right here, and it simply looks at the dependency column and takes the task end date of that task. So instructor shoot, this is matching this, and notice how these are all instructor shoots. These dependency end dates all match the end date of the instructor shoot, excuse me. The dependency start date is simply the dependency's task start date. So this is very similar to the VLOOKUP in Google Sheets, except a little more easier to write because you don't have to do VLOOKUP and referencing a bunch of columns and cells. And then the task end date simply is just the task start date plus the duration in this. So a little easier compared to the other platforms when it comes to writing formulas, because you can just write them out with words, and then you can pick the start date for the very first instructor shoot task right here. And if I go down here, the Gantt chart view may not be as powerful as SmartSheet or Wrike or even ClickUp, but it does give you a basic Gantt chart view, and you can also click into each bar to see all the columns associated with that given task, and you can kind of get that similar waterfall feel as the other platforms, and also even to Google Sheets, you get that similar kind of waterfall shape here. And then finally, you can also view the same data. They're all connected as a calendar, and you can click on each of these tasks to look at the overall view of that row. So that is a summary of how to do task dependencies across various different platforms.